Hey guys, tonight we look at a substance that Victorian England decided was medicine, entertainment, and a perfectly reasonable thing to pass around at dinner parties, sometimes all three in the same evening. It was legal, it was fashionable, it was technically the same thing they were using in hospitals to knock people out for surgery, and for the better part of 50 years, nobody seems to have found this particularly worrying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how far these stories travel while the rest of the world is supposed to be asleep. Now dim the lights, find somewhere comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's story together. In the 1830s, in the drawing rooms of Boston and Edinburgh and London, a new kind of social event was quietly becoming fashionable. There was no dancing, no cards, no particular entertainment required. A host would acquire a small bottle of ether from a chemist, and the guests would pass it around the room and inhale from it, and for the next 15 to 30 minutes, everyone would feel considerably better about everything. This was called an ether frolic. It was not considered unusual. Medical students attended them for professional curiosity. Lawyers attended them for the same reasons lawyers attend most things. Writers and poets attended because writers and poets attend everything. The frolics were held in respectable homes in the early evening, and they were followed by supper. Nobody thought of this as drug use. It simply had not occurred to anyone to call it that. The effects were specific and, by Victorian standards, quite appealing. Warmth first, spreading from the chest outward, then a lightness in the limbs, then the particular sensation that the people you were speaking with were more interesting than usual, and that you yourself were more interesting than usual, and that the evening had improved in some hard-to-define but undeniable way. The whole experience lasted roughly as long as a glass of wine took to drink, and the next morning left none of wine's complications behind. What made ether especially convenient was how quickly it left. The effects were over in 20 minutes. The substance itself cleared the body within an hour. You could be intoxicated, recover, and repeat the process 2 or 3 times in an evening, and wake up the following morning with no particular evidence that any of it had happened. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of intoxicant a society that valued respectability would design if asked to design one. Nobody had designed it. That was simply how it worked. Ether itself had been around for centuries before anyone thought to do anything useful with it. A German pharmacist named Valerius Cordus first described its synthesis back in the 1540s, mixing sulfuric acid with ethanol and producing a volatile liquid he called sweet oil of vitriol. Paracelsus, who tested everything on everything and had opinions about most of it, noticed that chickens given the liquid would fall into a prolonged sleep and wake without apparent harm. He concluded that it quieted all suffering without injury and relieved all pain. He did not pursue the matter further, which is one of the more consequential decisions in the history of not following up on things. The name ether came later, borrowed from the Greek word for the pure air of the upper atmosphere. This was either poetic or aspirational, depending on how familiar you were with what it actually smelled like. For the next 2 centuries, ether drifted around the edges of medicine without anyone quite working out what to do with it. It was taken orally for headaches and whooping cough, applied to the skin for various complaints, occasionally inhaled for chest conditions, and occasionally not used at all. Nobody knew what to do with a substance that made animals unconscious, but could also be served at parties. These seemed like different categories of thing, and the people sorting them were not in a hurry. In 1799, a young chemist named Humphrey Davy opened a research institution in Bristol and began inhaling gases for science. His primary interest was nitrous oxide, which he found produced remarkable euphoria, suppressed pain almost entirely, and was very enjoyable to take with friends. He invited poets, engineers, and scientists to try it. Robert Southey tried it. Samuel Taylor Coleridge tried it. The son of James Watt, inventor of the steam engine, tried it and wrote an enthusiastic account. Davy noted in his records that the gas appeared to block pain almost entirely and suggested it might be useful during surgical operations. His notes were filed away. Nobody followed up for 40 years, during which time a considerable number of people had surgery while fully conscious, and suffered accordingly, which was unfortunate but apparently not urgent enough to revisit. By the 1830s, ether had joined nitrous oxide on the social circuit. Travelling showmen had discovered that a demonstration of ether inhalation drew larger crowds than most other acts, partly because the effects were visible and partly because audience members could participate. The volunteer would inhale, stagger slightly, become briefly and entertainingly strange, and then recover to the applause of the crowd. This was considered entertainment. It was also, in at least one important respect, a medical lecture, though neither the showman nor the audience were thinking of it that way. Medical students attended these demonstrations in significant numbers. Their interest was partly professional and partly the same interest that leads people to attend ether frolics in general, which is that it seemed enjoyable and harmless and nobody had told them not to. One of these students was Crawford Long. Long was studying medicine in Georgia in the early 1840s, and he attended ether frolics with considerable regularity, which he would later describe in professional terms, and which served, at the time, as straightforwardly social ones. At one such event, he watched a colleague walk directly into a piece of furniture at speed. The colleague looked at the bruise forming on his shin with mild interest. He felt nothing. Long looked at this for a moment. He was a surgeon, or training to be one, and the central problem of surgery at that time was not technique or knowledge or access to the patient. The problem was that the patient was awake. Surgical patients screamed. They had to be held down while the surgeon worked as quickly as possible, not because speed improved outcomes, but because every additional second was another second of screaming, and a shorter operation was the only mercy available. The technical skill of the era was inseparable from the capacity to ignore what it sounded like. Long connected what he had just watched to that problem. He made a note. He waited. In the spring of 1842, a patient named James Venable came to Long with 2 small tumours on the back of his neck. Venable had been delaying the procedure because he was afraid of the pain. Long told Venable he had an idea. He saturated a cloth with ether. Venable inhaled. Venable lost consciousness. Long removed one of the tumours. Long charged $2, one for the ether and one for the surgery. Venable woke up and reported feeling nothing at all. Long had just performed the first surgery under general anesthesia in recorded history. He told almost no one. He did not publish. He continued using ether quietly in his Georgia practice for the next several years, producing results that were consistently successful and consistently undocumented. His reasons for this are not entirely clear, which has given historians considerable room to speculate. The most charitable explanation is that he wanted to accumulate more evidence before making a claim. A less charitable one involves the observation that documentation was available to him throughout this period. Crawford Long published his findings in 1849. By that point the news had been out for 3 years. Someone else had held the demonstration that history decided to remember, in a rather more public setting, with a rather larger audience, and a surgeon standing nearby with a gift for the memorable sentence. William Morton was a dentist in Boston. His professional life consisted largely of extracting teeth from patients who were awake during the procedure, which was, by any measure, a suboptimal arrangement for everyone present. Morton had attended ether frolics. He had also spoken with a chemist named Charles Jackson about the properties of purified ether and whether, administered correctly, it might render a patient insensible to pain. Jackson told him it might. Morton acquired some purified ether. He tested it on his dog. He tested it on a goldfish. He tested it on himself. He tested it on a patient named Eben Frost, who came to his practice with a toothache in September of 1846 and agreed, somewhat optimistically, to let Morton try the ether before extracting the tooth. Frost reported feeling nothing. Morton immediately arranged a more public demonstration. The Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, agreed to let him show his method in their surgical amphitheatre, a dome-shaped room that would later be known as the ether dome, though at the time it was just a room with a domed ceiling and a table in the middle. The patient was Edward Abbott, 20 years old, with a vascular tumour on the left side of his neck. The surgeon was John Collins Warren, 68 years old, distinguished and professionally sceptical of claims he had not personally verified. Morton arrived late. The audience of students and physicians had already assembled. Warren had already made a remark, recorded in several accounts, to the effect that as Dr. Morton had apparently not arrived, they might as well proceed without him. Morton arrived as this observation was being delivered, set up his glass apparatus, placed the mouthpiece over Abbott's face, and waited. Abbott lost consciousness in approximately 4 minutes. Warren performed the surgery. Abbott did not move. The tumour was removed. Abbott was revived. He reported that he had experienced something like a dream, and that he had felt nothing during the procedure itself. Warren turned to the assembled audience. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is no humbug. The report of Morton's demonstration left Boston in November of 1846 on a ship to England. It arrived in London in December and was read by surgeons who had spent entire careers operating on patients who screamed. The response was not measured scientific assessment. It was something closer to relief. Within weeks, operations under ether were being performed in London. Within months, the practice had spread across Europe. The adoption was faster than almost any medical development before or since, which is perhaps less surprising when you consider what surgery had been like the week before. James Young Simpson, a Scottish obstetrician working in Edinburgh, was paying close attention. Simpson found ether effective but imperfect. The induction took too long. The recovery was unpleasant. The quantities required for longer procedures were awkward. He was certain there was something better. Simpson's method for evaluating potential anesthetics was direct. He would gather 2 or 3 colleagues at his dining table in Edinburgh, acquire a sample of whatever compound he was currently investigating, and they would all inhale it together and discuss the effects until the effects became too significant for discussion. In November of 1847, Simpson and 2 colleagues tried chloroform. They inhaled it. They found it extremely agreeable. They became more agreeable than usual. Then they became unconscious. Simpson woke up under the dining table. One colleague was found in another room with no clear memory of having moved there. Simpson concluded that chloroform was superior to ether. He was correct about the anesthetic properties. He was less correct about the safety, but that would take some years to become apparent. The person who gave anesthesia its most significant public endorsement was not a surgeon. She was a queen, and she was not particularly interested in the theological debate her decision would provoke. In April of 1853, Queen Victoria gave birth to Prince Leopold with John Snow in attendance. Snow had already established his reputation by tracing a cholera outbreak to a water pump on Broad Street in London, an achievement that required him to convince a committee to remove a pump handle, which was in many ways the hardest part. He had since applied the same methodical attention to chloroform anesthesia, and he administered it to Victoria during the delivery. Victoria found it agreeable. She would later describe the experience in terms that made clear she considered the matter settled. The Church of England did not consider the matter settled. Several prominent figures within it argued that the pain of childbirth was divinely ordained, described in Genesis as one of the consequences of the fall, and that using chemistry to circumvent it was essentially disputing God's recorded judgment on the subject. Victoria's response to this argument is not formally documented. The argument did not persist long. While all of this was happening in operating theatres and royal households and Edinburgh dining rooms, something entirely separate was developing in the market towns of County Londonderry, in the north of Ireland. It had nothing to do with surgery. It had nothing to do with science. It had to do with a Franciscan friar named Theobald Matthew, and an oversight that nobody noticed until it was too late. Matthew had been conducting a temperance campaign across Ireland since 1838. The campaign was straightforward. He travelled from town to town, gathered people in public squares and church halls, and administered a pledge of total abstinence from alcohol. He was exceptionally good at this. His manner was direct and warm. People believed him. By the time his campaign reached its peak, somewhere close to 3 million Irish people had taken the pledge. The pledge said alcohol. It did not say ether. This was not immediately obvious as a problem. Ether was not a drink in the way whiskey was a drink. It was a chemical product, sold by chemists, not taverns, associated with laboratories and medical practice rather than with the kind of social dissolution Matthew was working against. A person who had sworn not to touch alcohol and then purchased a small bottle of ether from the chemist on market day was, in the strict technical sense, keeping their word. The chemists of County Londonderry and County Tyrone and County Donegal noted that demand had increased. They ordered more stock. By the 1860s, the ether drinking culture in the north and west of Ireland had become a community institution, conducted openly at markets and wakes and social gatherings, with the small brown bottles passing between neighbours the way a bottle of something stronger might once have passed. By the 1870s, there were towns that smelled of ether before you could see them. Draperstown in County Londonderry became the most documented example. Reports from observers describe market days there in primarily olfactory terms. The sweet chemical smell of diethyl ether hovered over the stalls before you arrived, produced by the fact that a significant portion of the people conducting business that day had consumed some that morning, and some were consuming more as the afternoon progressed. Local chemists were moving hundreds of small bottles a week. One physician in the area described the situation as an improvement on what had preceded it. The hangovers were shorter, the violence was lower, the poverty was exactly the same as it had always been, but the immediate indicators suggested a community functioning somewhat better than before. He was not wrong about the short-term comparisons. He was also not thinking about what happened when the government eventually noticed and decided to do something about it. That part was coming, but not yet. In the meantime, ether was doing two completely separate things in two completely separate places, and the people involved in each had no knowledge of the other. The surgeons in Boston and London were not watching market days in Draperstown. The ether drinkers in Draperstown were not reading the Lancet. The same substance that was making surgery humane was also making Thursdays more manageable in County Londonderry, and nobody had assembled these two facts into a picture that required a response. The picture was assembling itself, though. Reports were beginning to reach London. A physician here, a chemist there, a letter to the British Medical Journal noting conditions in rural Ulster with the measured alarm of someone who wants to be taken seriously. Someone in Parliament was eventually going to read them. But first, there was the friar. And the friar had a problem. 3 million people had kept their word and kept it in a way he had not anticipated. And the gap between what the pledge said and what it had produced was becoming, in certain market towns on certain mornings, very difficult to ignore. While all of that was developing in County Londonderry, the friar's problem, the loophole, the small brown bottles appearing on chemists' shelves across 3 counties, something rather different was happening in London. The same substance was there too. It had been there since before the Irish version started, moving through a completely separate set of rooms, among a completely separate set of people, for reasons that had nothing to do with temperance pledges or the price of whiskey. Same substance, different room, different price, different everything really, except the part where it was ether, and nobody thought it was a problem. Thomas Lint was a medical student at St Bartholomew's Hospital in London in 1847, and he wrote about what he and his colleagues were doing with the kind of enthusiasm that suggests he expected to be understood rather than condemned. "We sit round a table and suck," he wrote, "like many nabobs with their hookers. It's glorious." He then went on to describe the experience from the inside in some detail, in the confident tone of a man sharing a discovery rather than confessing a vice. What he was describing was an ether party. The table, the apparatus, the students rotating the inhaler between them while the effects arrived and then departed, and then arrived again if someone felt the occasion warranted a second turn. The laughter that came with the warmth and the quiet that sometimes followed it, and then the return to ordinary consciousness with nothing to mark the interval, except the memory of having briefly felt rather well about everything. These gatherings were not rare, they were not secret. They happened in rooms adjacent to the same buildings where the students attended lectures on anatomy and surgical technique, and the juxtaposition did not strike anyone as contradictory, because the substance involved was the same substance being discussed in those lectures. Medical students were, in their own professional estimation, conducting an investigation. The fact that the investigation was enjoyable did not, in their view, disqualify it as inquiry. Nobody in that room considered themselves to be doing anything unusual. The substance was in the medical literature. They were studying medicine. The connection between those two facts seemed, to everyone present, entirely natural. Close on, this was what the English ether party looked like from the inside. Entirely ordinary, moderately glorious, and unremarkable to everyone who was there. The apparatus itself was a modest object for something that was doing fairly significant work. A glass globe, or sometimes a bladder made from animal tissue fitted with a short tube. Inside, a sponge or cloth soaked in ether. The guest placed the tube to their lips and inhaled slowly, and the vapours entered the lungs, and from there they entered everything else almost immediately. The smell announced itself before the apparatus arrived across the table. Sweetish, chemical, faintly fruity, not unpleasant exactly, but unmistakably itself, the kind of smell that once you had encountered it you would always recognise, which was the only sense in which ether parties left any evidence at all. The experience at recreational doses was specific enough that the accounts from different people in different cities in different decades agree on the broad sequence. Warmth first, spreading from the chest outward into the limbs, then a lightness, not dizziness exactly, something more deliberate, the body deciding it weighed slightly less than usual. Then the particular sensation that the people you were with had become more interesting, and that you yourself had become more interesting, and that the room had generally improved in a way that was difficult to specify but impossible to miss. Some reported a brief clarity, thoughts arriving faster, connections forming between things that ordinarily stayed separate. Others simply felt well. A number of accounts mention laughter arriving without any clear cause, the way laughter does when something invisible is quietly shifted. The whole thing lasted roughly as long as a second glass of wine takes to drink, and produced none of wine's subsequent complications. Within 20 minutes, the whole thing was over. The warmth receded, the lightness resolved. The room returned to its ordinary proportions. Close on, every other intoxicant left something behind, a smell, a flush, a wobble, a sentiment that needed apologising for the following morning. This one simply stopped and left the room exactly as it had found it. From St. Bartholomew's the habit moved upward without much resistance. Medical students had the apparatus and the knowledge. The upper class had the drawing rooms and the social occasion that needed filling. The transfer was not complicated. A host acquired ether from the same chemist who supplied the household medicine cabinet, through the same account on the same bill. It arrived in the same kind of bottle as the other preparations on the shelf. There was no separate category for it, no raised eyebrow at the counter, no requirement to explain what it was for. By the early 1850s, ether evenings had become a recognised feature of certain social circles. Punch satirised them, which in Victorian England was the reliable sign that something had become sufficiently mainstream to be worth mocking, and also that it was not quite disreputable enough to be worth condemning. The apparatus had moved from the medical college table to the drawing room side table, which represented a significant journey in terms of social endorsement. Respectable hosts were acquiring ether the way they acquired claret, as something the household simply had, for occasions that called for it. The occasions multiplied. An ether hour after dinner, before cards. A gathering specifically organised around it, with the apparatus passed between guests as conversation continued. Mixed company, men and women together, which in Victorian social terms was its own kind of endorsement, because respectable women were present, and therefore the thing being done was respectable. Nothing hidden, nothing furtive. The thing was discussed openly in polite company, because nothing about it, yet, had given polite company a reason to lower its voice. Close on, a society that had spent decades performing sobriety had found something that performed sobriety right back at it, and had filed it, without apparent difficulty, under entertainment. Chloroform arrived on the social circuit a few years behind ether, and quickly established itself in slightly different circles. Where ether was associated with the medical college and the drawing room party, chloroform was finding its way into more intimate spaces, the tea room, the private parlour, the handbag. Ladies were carrying small vials of it as a remedy for nerves, for headaches, for what Victorian medicine described as the general nervous excitability to which women were considered particularly prone, and which Victorian life was particularly well designed to produce. Doctors prescribed it for anxiety, without examining too carefully what prolonged treatment for anxiety implied, which was perhaps because examining it carefully would have required them to note that they were prescribing a surgical anesthetic as a social lubricant, and noting that would have been professionally inconvenient. The language available for describing chloroform was the language of medicine, a calming agent, a nerve remedy, something to take the edge off the particular difficulty of existing in a state of continuous social performance. That language was not wrong. It was simply doing more work than it appeared to. The substance also appeared in other configurations, mixed into spirits in small quantities, added to beverages at social occasions where the host wished to ensure a particular quality of evening, not always with the knowledge of the guests, which was the side of chloroform's social career that the respectable press did not discuss directly, but that the sensation newspapers found entirely worth discussing. Journalists and doctors began noting women in tea rooms whose composure had acquired an unusual quality, a slightly remote cheerfulness, a tendency to find things funnier than the occasion warranted. The reports were observational rather than alarmed. Nobody had quite assembled the observation into a concern. Close on, 2 powerful surgical anesthetics were now circulating socially, both wrapped entirely in the language of medicine, and the language of medicine had at that moment made them impossible to argue with. This was the core of it, and it is worth pausing here because it is the thing that made the entire English ether culture possible for as long as it lasted. You could not object to recreational ether without also objecting to the ether dome. These were not separable positions. The substance that Warren had used on Edward Abbott in 1846, the substance that the Exeter Flying Post had described as without parallel in the history of medicine, the substance the London newspapers had celebrated as the conquest of pain. That substance was the one sitting on the drawing-room table, and any vocabulary of disapproval had to account for both at once. The temperance movement had spent decades building a precise and well-rehearsed vocabulary for condemning alcohol. Weakness, moral failure, the destruction of families, the ruin of the working poor. That vocabulary was detailed, emotionally resonant, and widely understood. And it fit alcohol perfectly and ether not at all. Ether was not alcohol. Ether was the thing that had made surgery bearable. Ether had been administered to the Queen. The medical profession had not merely tolerated ether, it had celebrated it, published it, brought it into teaching hospitals, made it the foundation of a new discipline. Parliament had said nothing restricting it. The Church of England had objected to chloroform once, and then fallen silent when Victoria made her position clear. The argument that suffering was divinely ordained had not survived its first encounter with a queen who found chloroform agreeable and considered the matter settled. There was no institutional authority, no church, no parliament, no professional body, prepared to stand up and explain why inhaling the same compound in a drawing room was a moral failing when inhaling it in an operating theatre was a triumph of civilization. Any attempt to make that argument would have required the person making it to also argue against the ether dome, against the Queen's endorsement, against the entire medical establishment, and in favour of returning to the era when surgeons worked as fast as possible because the patient was screaming and speed was the only mercy available. Nobody was prepared to argue that. The temperance movement, which had a vocabulary for everything, fell genuinely silent on ether, not because it had missed the phenomenon, it was visible enough, but because the argument simply was not there. This was not a gap anyone had planned. It was not a deliberate loophole in the way the Irish Pledge loophole was deliberate. The friar had simply not thought to specify ether, and Dr. Kelly had noticed the oversight. The English moral gap was structural, built into the era's own logic, invisible until you tried to object to something and found you had no language for it. Close on, Victorian morality had a framework for almost everything. It had no framework for a substance that arrived dressed in the same clothes as the conquest of pain, and it was not the habit of Victorian morality to improvise. What the experience actually felt like beyond the clinical sequence of warmth and lightness is worth dwelling on, because the accounts are more consistent than you might expect from something that was, by any reasonable measure, a powerful central nervous system depressant being used recreationally in domestic settings by people who would have objected very strongly to being described that way. The clarity reports are the most interesting. Several people who wrote about their ether experiences in letters, in medical journals, in the occasional frank memoir, described a brief period in which their thinking felt accelerated, their observations felt sharper, and the connections between ideas felt more available than usual. Not hallucination, not confusion. Something closer to the opposite, an unusual lucidity, a feeling of having access to a slightly better version of one's own mind. The French novelist Guy de Maupassant, who used ether for medical purposes and then continued for reasons less easy to categorize, described reasoning under its influence with the utmost clearness and depth, with extraordinary energy and intellectual pleasure. He found this compelling enough to keep going, which is a form of endorsement. This clarity lasted perhaps 5 minutes before the warmth deepened into something more straightforwardly sedating. But those 5 minutes were, for some people, the point. The clarity arrived, was used or noted or simply enjoyed, and then the rest of the experience ran its course and stopped, and there was nothing afterward. The person stood up from their chair exactly as they had sat down, with no flush in the face, no heaviness in the head, no sentiment hanging over from the preceding hour that would need to be accounted for in the morning. The high was real. People were not imagining the warmth or the lightness or the brief agreeable sense that the world had improved. Close on, but what the drawing rooms were really using more than the high was the exit, the fact that the experience stopped cleanly, left nothing behind, and could not be detected by anyone who had not been in the room. Victorian respectability was a performance conducted in public signs. How you smelled when you arrived somewhere, whether your face was composed, whether your gait was steady and your speech was considered, whether you were, in the useful Victorian phrase, quite yourself. Alcohol failed all of these tests in sequence, and the temperance movement had built an entire moral infrastructure around those failures. The reddened face, the unsteady step, the sentiment that arrived uninvited and left without permission. The morning after that required explanation. Ether passed every test. There was no smell of alcohol on the breath. None at all, because it was not alcohol. The face did not flush. The gait did not unsteady. The speech, 20 minutes after the apparatus had been put away, was exactly as considered as it had been before. The eyes were clear. The posture was composed. The person was, to every available measure, quite themselves. A man could be intoxicated at 7 in the evening and be entirely recovered by past, and nobody who had not been present would know the difference, because there was no visible difference to know. A woman could take an ether hour at a friend's house and come back to her household entirely composed, calmer, if anything, her nerves having been addressed through the same substance her doctor would have prescribed. There was nothing to confess. There was nothing that needed to be apologized for the following morning. There was nothing at all. The substance had the remarkable property of fitting invisibly around the exact shape of Victorian self-presentation. It asked for nothing visible in return. Close on, across the Irish Sea, they had found the same exit, at a penny a draught, for reasons that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with the price of whiskey. And the exit there was considerably less invisible. The towns themselves smelled of it before you arrived. But that was Ireland, and this was London, and the distance between them was, in 1850, rather larger than the Irish Sea. The distance between London and County Londonderry was, in the 1840s, larger than geography alone could explain. London had drawing rooms and apparatus, and the educated leisure to conduct an ether hour between dinner and cards. County Londonderry had something else. A temperance pledge signed by half the adult population of Ireland, a region of considerable poverty, and a physician named Dr. Kelly, who had noticed something nobody else had thought to act on. The two versions of the story had begun at different moments, in different countries, for entirely different reasons. In London, the ether party had arrived as a consequence of Morton's demonstration. Fashionable, medically endorsed, equipped with purpose-built glassware. In Ireland, it arrived as a consequence of a gap in a pledge, spotted by one doctor in one market town, and it arrived not with apparatus but with a small bottle and a glass of water. What the two versions shared was the substance and the need, and the complete absence of anyone in authority who had yet assembled the situation into a problem. Dr. Kelly practised in Draperstown, a market town in County Londonderry, and around 1845 he arrived at an observation that was, in its way, as consequential as anything Crawford Long had worked out in Georgia 3 years earlier. The pledge said alcohol. Ether was not alcohol. A man who had sworn total abstinence from alcohol and then purchased a small bottle of ether from the chemist on market day was, in the strict technical sense, keeping his word. This was not a complicated observation. It did not require legal training or theological sophistication. It required only a working knowledge of what the pledge said and a familiarity with what ether did, both of which Dr. Kelly possessed in full. He began dispensing liquid ether to patients and friends as a non-alcoholic intoxicant, not with fanfare, not as an experiment, but as a practical solution to a practical problem. A community that wanted relief from the conditions of its life had taken a pledge that foreclosed the usual means of finding it. Ether was available, legal, cheap, and not covered by the pledge. The solution was obvious once someone had looked for it. He was not, by any account that survives, a man who understood what he was setting in motion. He was a physician in a market town who had identified a need and a substance that met it. The fact that the need extended to 3 million people who had signed the same pledge, and that the substance was available from ordinary commercial suppliers at a penny a time, was not something that a physician in Draperstown in 1845 had particular reason to think through to its conclusion. One doctor, one town, one quiet decision that nobody recorded at the time as particularly significant. The most consequential decisions in history rarely announce themselves as such. This one was made across a counter in a market town, probably on a Thursday, and probably without anyone present understanding what they had started. What accelerated the process? What turned a local physician's pragmatic solution into a regional institution was not economics alone, though economics mattered. It was a priest. At some point in the years following Dr. Kelly's initial distribution, a member of the clergy in the region was asked to comment on ether drinking by a parishioner who was, perhaps, uncertain whether their new habit was compatible with their conscience. This was a reasonable uncertainty. The temperance movement was a religious movement as much as a social one. Father Matthew had framed abstinence in explicitly moral terms. A man who had stood in a public square and sworn before God to abstain from alcohol had reason to wonder whether the substance he was now taking on market days fell within the spirit of what he'd promised. The priest's response became the sentence that gave theological permission to everything that followed. Ether, he declared, was a liquor on which a man could get drunk with a clean conscience. Consider what that sentence does in a community where the pledge is not a private decision but a public identity, where the temperance movement has spent years building a vocabulary of shame around alcohol, the weakness it represented, the families it destroyed, the social standing it cost. where being seen drunk on whiskey carried consequences that extended beyond the personal into the professional and the social. A priest had now said that ether was different, not just different in chemistry, different in moral status. A man who drank ether was keeping the pledge. He was simply also, as a secondary matter, quite intoxicated. The distinction was, to anyone looking carefully, a distinction that the pledge itself had never actually drawn. The pledge said alcohol because alcohol was what Father Matthew had intended to prohibit, and ether had not been on anyone's mind in 1838 when the Total Abstinence Society was founded. But intention and language are different things, and it was the language that was binding. The priest had read the language. The distance between what the pledge intended and what that sentence now permitted was, it turned out, large enough to build an industry in. The experience of drinking ether rather than inhaling it was, in several respects, quite different from the drawing room version. Not better or worse exactly, different in kind. The London apparatus delivered the vapours slowly and deliberately. The Irish method was rather more direct. A small drop of ether was placed on the tongue while the drinker pinched the nose firmly shut. The nose was not optional. The smell and taste of liquid ether were, by any honest account, considerable challenges, and the experience of swallowing it without the nostril assistance was described by those who had tried it as heroic in the least flattering sense of the word. The drop on the tongue was then chased immediately with a full glass of water, which helped move things along and reduce the burning sensation that would otherwise establish itself in the throat with some enthusiasm, and then, within seconds, the effect. Dr. Ernest Hart, who studied the Irish ether habit and documented it carefully, described the sequence, the stages of excitement, mental confusion, loss of muscular control, and loss of consciousness following each other so rapidly that they could not be clearly separated. What took 20 minutes to arrive and depart in the London version happened here in something closer to 5. The Irish method hit harder and faster, which was part of its appeal in a region where time and money were limited, and efficiency in both directions was valued. On the other side, completely sober, no headache, no nausea, nothing. The body processed ether almost before the effect had time to fully establish itself, and what was left was the ordinary afternoon, unchanged. Close on, for a substance that produced this sequence reliably, for a penny, with no hangover and no smell of alcohol on the breath. The question was never why people adopted it. The question was why it took until 1845 for someone to notice the gap. This created a specific and largely unprecedented problem for law enforcement in the region, which was discovering that ether drunkenness and alcohol drunkenness were the same in behaviour but entirely different in duration. A man arrested for disorderly conduct under the influence of ether presented the constable with a situation that the existing legal frameworks had not anticipated. By the time the police van reached the station, which was not a long journey in a market town, the ether had processed itself through the man's system and departed entirely. The man who stepped out of the van was sober, not recovering, not impaired, not in the careful early stages of becoming sober. Simply sober. He smelled of nothing identifiable as alcohol. He showed no signs of intoxication. He had no legal obligation to explain what he had consumed an hour earlier, and no visible evidence remained that he had consumed anything at all. The charge did not stick. There was nothing to charge him with. He went home. This happened often enough to become a documented pattern, rather than an isolated incident, and the documentation suggests a constabulary that was genuinely uncertain how to respond. A man who was demonstrably drunk when arrested and demonstrably sober when booked presented a problem that the law of public intoxication had not been designed to address, because the law of public intoxication assumed that intoxication lasted long enough to still be present when you reached the police station. Ether declined to cooperate with this assumption. There is something almost comic about the recorded accounts of these encounters, the sergeant's confusion, the man's blameless sobriety, the paperwork that had nowhere productive to go. Though the comedy had an edge to it, because what the constabulary was actually encountering was an intoxicant designed, by its own chemistry, to be invisible to the systems built to detect and punish exactly this kind of behaviour. Close on, an intoxicant that defeated not only social detection, but legal detection, had a particular advantage in a society where the law was beginning to take an active interest in what people were drinking, and the advantage would only become more relevant as Parliament assembled the numbers. 1 penny per draught. This is the number that explains almost everything about why the Irish ether culture spread as fast and as widely as it did, in the specific counties it spread through, among the specific population it reached. County Londonderry, County Tyrone, the surrounding counties, these were not prosperous regions. The agricultural economy was difficult. The poverty was real and persistent. The conditions of daily life in the 1850s and 60s in rural Ulster were such that the difference between 1 penny and several pence was a meaningful difference. Whiskey cost more, beer cost more. Whatever comfort might be extracted from either of them cost more and lasted, in terms of net effect relative to price, considerably less efficiently. Ether cost 1 penny per draught. A single bottle provided multiple doses. A man who had a penny could be intoxicated, sober, and intoxicated again before the afternoon was finished, and wake the following morning with no physical consequences and no smell on his breath, and no evidence that any of it had happened. Compare this to whiskey, which cost more, lasted longer in the unpleasant sense rather than the pleasant one, produced a hangover that interfered with the following morning's work, and left a man smelling distinctly of what he had done. Ether was, by almost every practical measure, the more efficient product. Ether was not adopted in these counties because it was fashionable. It was not adopted because the residents had read the medical literature or were curious about the properties of anesthetic compounds. It was adopted because it was the cheapest effective solution to a problem that did not go away simply because the pledge said it should, and because, crucially, the pledge said it was allowed. Close on, the same substance that London drawing rooms were acquiring through purpose-built apparatus on the household chemist's account was being handed across a grocer's counter in Draperstown for the price of a small loaf of bread, and the people buying it were not thinking about apparatus or drawing rooms or the ether dome or any of the rest of it. From Draperstown the habit moved outward, and it moved through the existing retail infrastructure rather than around it. This is the detail that separates the Irish ether culture from anything that might be called a drug trade. There were no back-alley dealers, no hidden networks, no clandestine supply chains operating in the shadows of the legitimate economy. There was the grocer's shelf, there was the druggist's counter, there was the publican who had diversified his stock to include something his customers could drink, without technically violating the pledge they had sworn before God. There was the travelling salesman who made his rounds of the villages and added ether to the standard order alongside whatever else the households required. The small brown bottles appeared on the same shelves as flour and candles and salt. They were ordered through the same commercial channels as everything else the shop stocked. The supply came from distilleries in England and Scotland, which produced ether in bulk for industrial and medical purposes, and had no particular reason to investigate how County Londonderry was using its allocation. The demand was steady, the product was legal, the transactions were entirely unremarkable to everyone conducting them. By the 1860s, ether drinking in the north and west of Ireland had ceased to be a local curiosity and become a community institution, practised openly at markets, passed between neighbours at wakes and social gatherings and ordinary evenings, present wherever people gathered the way any social substance is present when a community has adopted it completely. Not hidden beneath the transaction, but part of it. An unremarkable feature of ordinary commercial and social life in a region where it had been ordinary for long enough that nobody could quite remember when it had started. Close on, there was nothing hidden about it. Nobody involved believed they were doing anything that required concealment, because nothing about the transaction from the distillery to the grocer to the customer had been constructed with concealment in mind. By the 1870s there were towns in counties Londonderry and Tyrone that smelled of ether before you could see them. The sweet chemical smell, that same faintly fruity, unmistakably synthetic note that had announced Morton's inhaler in the operating theatre in Boston, was now the ambient atmosphere of Irish market towns on fair days. It hovered over the stalls before you arrived. It was on the people you passed in the street, on the breath of traders conducting business, in the air of shops and public houses and the yards outside them. One physician who travelled into the region in this period described his approach to one of these towns in primarily olfactory terms, the smell reaching him at a distance, thickening as he entered the town, present everywhere and on everyone, inescapable. Reports from outside observers described market days in Draperstown and the surrounding towns in language that was more atmospheric than statistical. The whole fair day suffused with it, the smell clinging to the hedges and stone walls and wooden stalls long after the trading had finished and the crowd had dispersed. It was not the smell of a scandal. It was not the smell of something concealed and furtive. It was simply the smell of a fair day in this part of Ireland, as unremarkable to the people living inside it as the smell of coal smoke or damp earth or any other feature of the local atmosphere they had grown up in. The same smell that had once announced a medical revolution, that had been present in the ether dome on the morning Warren said this is no humbug, was now the smell of a Thursday morning in market towns across a significant stretch of Northern Ireland. It was no longer a social occasion organised around an apparatus and a drawing-room table. It was the weather. And nobody in those towns going about their business in the sweet chemical air had yet been told that the weather was about to change. The weather, in this case, had people in it. Behind the smell, behind the abstract fact of towns that smelled of ether before you could see them, were specific people doing specific things on specific afternoons. The accounts that survive from the region describe not a crisis but a community. Mothers and daughters, neighbours, traders, farmers arriving in town on market day, school children sent to run errands. The ordinary social life of rural Ulster in the 1860s and 70s, conducted in a sweet chemical atmosphere that its participants had ceased to notice, the way people cease to notice any smell they live inside long enough. The outside observers who travelled into these counties in this period and wrote reports tended to describe the same thing in two different registers. The official register noted quantities, prices, medical consequences, public order implications. The observational register, the part that described what they actually saw, described something else, a community going about its business. People who knew each other, greeting each other, conducting the transactions and conversations of ordinary life in an atmosphere that struck the visitor as remarkable, and struck nobody who lived in it as remarkable at all. The Ether Bee was the domestic version, a social gathering organised around communal ether drinking held in the home in the afternoon, structured roughly the way a tea might be structured except with a different substance on the table, the small brown bottles, the glass of water beside them, neighbours arriving, taking their place, passing the bottle in rotation. Norman Kerr, a physician who documented the Irish ether habit in considerable detail, and published his findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1891, described the scene with the precision of someone who had observed it rather than imagined it. The mother, he wrote, may be seen with her daughters, and maybe a neighbouring Irish woman or two at a friendly ether bee. What is notable about this sentence is what it does not say. It does not say the mother is hiding from her husband. It does not say the daughters are ashamed. It does not say the neighbours have come in through a back entrance. It describes women gathered in a home on an afternoon, doing something that everyone present considered ordinary. The ether bee was not squalid, and it was not secretive. It was domestic in the same way that a tea is domestic, a social occasion with a clear purpose, a recognised form, and participants who knew what they had come for and found the occasion unremarkable. The bottle moved around the table in the same way that a pot of tea moves around a table. The conversation continued. The afternoon progressed. At some point the gathering concluded and the neighbours went home. This was the Irish ether party. The apparatus was different from St. Bartholomew's. The social class was different. The price was different. The function was the same, and the afternoon was the same, and the quality of ordinary that surrounded it was indistinguishable from any other ordinary afternoon in the region. On fair days, the ether moved outdoors. Market days in towns like Draperstown drew traders and buyers from the surrounding countryside, and by the 1870s they drew them into a smell that arrived before the town did. The sweet, chemical air was present at the stalls before commerce began and still clinging to the hedges and walls, hours after the last trader had packed up and left. One observer, arriving in Draperstown on a fair day in this period, described the approach in terms that read less like a report and more like a description of weather, the smell thickening as he entered the town, the quality of the air changing before anything else changed. The bottles moved alongside the goods. A trader who had taken a draft before the day began was conducting business in the ordinary way, buying and selling, arguing prices, making decisions, assessing livestock, performing all the practical calculations that a market day required. The ether was not interfering with the fair day. It was present during the fair day, which is a different thing. It was as much a feature of the occasion as the mud or the noise or the livestock smell, and about as remarkable to the people there. One quality that fair days in these towns shared with fair days everywhere was that they were sociable. People who had not seen each other since the last market day met and spoke. Business was conducted alongside conversation. The small brown bottles moved between acquaintances in the same spirit as anything else that moves between acquaintances at a fair. Offered, accepted, returned, with the easy familiarity of people who share the same habits and have done so long enough that the habits require no introduction. An observer trying to identify who among the crowd had taken ether and who had not would have found the exercise difficult. The answer, on certain fair days in certain towns, was most of them. Close on, a fair day that smelled of ether was, in this part of Ireland in this period, a fair day proceeding exactly as expected. The children present a different kind of evidence. Shopkeepers in the region had developed a custom of offering a small amount of ether to children sent on errands by their parents. This was a hospitality gesture, the way another shop in another town might offer a biscuit or a piece of sugar to a child who had come in on an errand. Not a large amount, not intended as a significant event, just a small courtesy extended to a young customer in the context of a transaction that had been completed. Schoolmasters in the surrounding area began reporting in this same period that children arrived at school in the morning with ether on their breath, not occasionally, with enough regularity to constitute a pattern that required reporting. The children were aged 10, 12, 14, old enough to have been sent on errands, young enough that the schoolmaster's concern was not entirely unreasonable. Norman Kerr documented this specifically in his 1891 account, including it in his portrait of a community where the substance had distributed itself through every layer of daily life. The schoolmasters reported it. What they reported it to, and what happened next, is less clear from the surviving records. The frameworks for addressing a situation in which children arrived at school, having consumed a surgical anesthetic, did not yet exist in any organised form. The substance was legal. The chemist had sold it legally. The shopkeeper had offered it in the spirit of ordinary commercial courtesy. The child had accepted it in the same spirit. Nobody in the chain of events had done anything that the existing rules identified as wrong. The habit had moved so completely into ordinary life that no generation in the region was encountering it as a novelty. Children were arriving at ether through breakfast, through the grocer's counter, through watching their mothers at the Ether Bee on Tuesday afternoons. It was present before they were old enough to have opinions about it. Close on, this was not a secret vice operating in the shadows of respectability. It was a community norm that had arrived so gradually and established itself so completely that nobody had thought to ask when it had started, because by the time anyone thought to ask, it had always been there. Ether was present at wakes. This is perhaps the detail that most clearly marks how completely the substance had embedded itself in the social life of the region. Because the wake, the gathering around the body of someone who had died, the communal acknowledgement of loss, is not an occasion that communities extend casually to new practices. The things present at wakes are the things a community considers fundamental: food, drink, the presence of neighbours, the specific ritual forms that mark grief as shared rather than private. A substance that appears at wakes has not merely been adopted, it has been incorporated into the structure of how the community understands itself. In the counties of Northern Ireland, where ether drinking had become established, the small brown bottles moved around the room at wakes alongside the food and the conversation. Not replacing the grief. That would misunderstand what wakes are for. Wakes are not an attempt to avoid grief. They are a way of sitting inside it with other people, with the practical business of eating and talking as a kind of scaffolding for the harder work. The ether fit inside this scaffolding. It was not a departure from the occasion's purpose. It was present the way it was present at other communal occasions in the region, as part of the social fabric, unremarkable to the people weaving it. Outside observers who mentioned ether at wakes tended to do so briefly, as one observation among several. The brevity is the point. A detail that requires a paragraph to explain is a detail that struck the observer as anomalous. A detail mentioned in passing, alongside other details of similar weight, is a detail that the observer understood as ordinary. The ether at wakes was ordinary. In a community where ether was ordinary, it appeared at ordinary events, close on, including the ones where ordinary life had temporarily stopped and the community had gathered to mark the fact. Not everyone who observed the Irish ether habit from the outside found it alarming. Some found it almost defensible. One physician working in the region during the height of the practice produced an assessment that was, by the standards of medical commentary on the subject, notably measured. The hangovers were shorter, he noted, than with whiskey, which was true because ether left none. The violence was lower, also documented, the correlation between ether drinking and public disorder being less pronounced than the correlation between whiskey and the same. The poverty was exactly the same as it had always been, which he noted without apparent surprise, because the poverty had always been there, and ether had not caused it. But the immediate indicators of community function, he suggested, were not obviously worse than they had been before ether, and were in some respects better. He was not wrong about the short-term comparisons. Ether did not produce hangovers. It did not produce the sustained impairment that heavy whiskey drinking produced. A man who drank ether in the morning was available for work by midday, in a way that a man who drank whiskey in the morning was frequently not. The arithmetic of productivity, taken in isolation, was not straightforwardly in whiskey's favour. A physician interested in the practical functioning of a community, in whether people showed up, whether work got done, whether the violence that often accompanied heavy alcohol use was present or absent, could read the available evidence and arrive at conclusions that were, within their own frame, reasonable. The frame was the problem. The physician had looked at the before and after of hangovers and public order. He had assessed the community's function by the indicators that his training had equipped him to assess. What he had not thought carefully about was what happens when a community's primary social substance is highly flammable and is being consumed daily and in some quantity by people who also smoke pipes. This was not a medical question that his framework naturally raised. It was, however, a practical question that the community was in the process of answering. Close on, the flames were coming. But they arrived from a direction he had not been looking, in a form that his otherwise reasonable assessment had left entirely unaddressed. The problem with drinking a substance that becomes a gas at body temperature is that the gas has to go somewhere. Ether, once swallowed, vaporized in the stomach and intestines with considerable efficiency, and the vapours produced needed to exit the body by whatever route was available. This produced in regular ether drinkers a volume and regularity of burping and flatulence that contemporaries described with a frankness that the Victorian period did not usually extend to bodily functions. The emissions were, by every account, substantial. They were also, being ether vapour, highly flammable. These two facts, combined with the region's existing custom of smoking pipes, created a set of conditions that the popular Science Monthly eventually found worth documenting. In 1878, that publication reported the case of a man who had been drinking ether and went to light his pipe. His breath caught fire. A person nearby held him down and poured water quickly into his mouth, by which the flame was put out. The account notes, and no great harm was done. The phrase "no great harm was done" carries the particular weight of a sentence written by someone who wanted to be accurate, and found accuracy, in this specific instance, somewhat inconvenient. Severe burns at both ends of the alimentary canal were described in medical literature as a common hazard among regular ether drinkers, common enough to appear in clinical discussions without particular alarm, as a known occupational consequence rather than a rare emergency requiring special comment. The fact that this consequence was known and documented and still described as common suggests a community that had absorbed the risk as part of the habit's landscape, the way any community absorbs the predictable risks of its practices over time. The drawing rooms of London were using the same substance and producing none of this, because the London version involved inhaling a modest quantity of vapour from an apparatus, under controlled conditions, in rooms that did not contain pipe smokers waiting to light up mid-session. The Irish version involved swallowing liquid ether in sufficient quantities and with sufficient regularity to turn the digestive system into something that required specific caution around open flame. Close on, the distance between the two versions of the ether habit was, by this point, the distance between an evening's entertainment and a practical consideration that a sensible man would factor into his decisions about when to smoke. The supply chain that delivered all of this, the ether bees, the fair days, the school morning breath, the flammable pipes, was not complicated. It was in fact the same supply chain that delivered everything else. Local chemists in the region were moving hundreds of small bottles of ether every week. The bottles arrived from distilleries in England and Scotland that produced ether in bulk quantities for industrial and pharmaceutical purposes and distributed it through standard commercial channels to retailers across Britain and Ireland. The retailers in the affected counties had noted over the course of some years that their ether allocation required regular and substantial replenishment. They ordered accordingly. The distilleries shipped accordingly. The travelling salesmen who called on the smaller villages added ether to their standard lines and found it a reliable seller, the kind of product that required no particular promotion because the demand was already there when they arrived. This was a commercial supply chain operating entirely in the open, without concealment and without apparent concern, because nothing about any transaction in the chain was illegal. The distillery had a licence. The chemist had a licence. The publican who had added ether to his stock had not violated any condition of his existing licence, because ether was not covered by the conditions that governed alcohol. The travelling salesman was selling a legal product to customers who wanted it. By the time anyone in London looked carefully at the combined volume of these transactions, which required assembling figures from across multiple counties and multiple years and presenting them in a form that could be read as a single number, the number was going to be considerable. Close on, the chemists knew. The salesman knew. The distilleries could have worked it out, but nobody had yet added it up and put it in a report addressed to Parliament, and until someone did, the supply chain continued to function exactly as it had been functioning, which was efficiently and without interruption. Someone added it up. Thomas Ledley was the man who assembled the figures and put them in a form that Parliament could not ignore. His report, presented to the British government in 1891, calculated that 17,000 gallons of ether were being consumed annually in the counties of Londonderry, Tyrone, Armagh, Monaghan and Fermanagh. 17,000 gallons in a relatively small region of Ireland every year. He also estimated the number of regular users, 100,000 people. These two figures, placed side by side on a page addressed to Parliament, had a quality that individual accounts of ether bees and fair day smells and flammable breath did not. Individual accounts could be dismissed as anecdote, as local colour, as the exaggeration of concerned observers. Numbers required a different response. 17,000 gallons and 100,000 people were not observations. They were arithmetic. And arithmetic, unlike atmosphere, has a way of arriving at its destination without being softened by the journey. Someone in Parliament read the report. The report was not possible to read as anything other than what it was. Ledley's figures were not the only documentation arriving in London at this point. Norman Kerr, whose account of the ether bee had already been noted by those following the Irish situation, had published in the Journal of the American Medical Association a portrait of the community that went considerably beyond the domestic scene. Sturdy Irish lads and beautiful Irish lasses, brimful of Hibernian wit, he wrote, are slaves to ether drunkenness. The sentence does several things simultaneously. It acknowledges the vitality and character of the people involved. It is not a portrait of degradation or moral failure. The lads are sturdy, the lasses are beautiful, the wit is Hibernian and brimful. These are not the vocabulary of a man writing about ruined lives. They are the vocabulary of a man writing about people he has observed and found recognisably human in their particularities. And these specific, vivid, recognisably human people are, Kerr notes without pause in the same sentence, slaves to ether drunkenness. The word slave sits at the end of a sentence that has worked carefully to establish the humanity of its subjects. It lands differently for having been placed there. Kerr continued with the texture of the habit at its peak. The schoolmasters and the morning breath, the shopkeepers and the children, the mothers and daughters at the ether bee, the fair days and the smell that preceded them. He was rendering a community not as a category of social problem to be addressed, but as a collection of specific people doing a specific thing, which is why his account had a quality that official figures lacked. Official figures described a quantity. Kerr described a life. The distinction between his account and Ledley's numbers is the distinction between what Parliament needed to act and what history needed to understand. Parliament needed the numbers. History needed Kerr. Close on, what made the Kerr account remarkable was not its horror. It was the fact that it contained so little, that it described the ether habit as something that had settled so completely into ordinary life that extraordinary description was no longer available. The ordinary, stated plainly, was the most alarming thing he could have written. Parliament did not move immediately to scheduling. It tried something else first. The government's initial response to the ether problem in Ireland was to adulterate the supply. Industrial ether, which was the grade being sold for drinking purposes, would be mixed with naphtha, a petroleum derivative with an odour and flavour that were, by any honest assessment, profoundly unpleasant. The logic was straightforward. Make the product unpalatable, and demand would collapse. People who were drinking ether because they wanted to be intoxicated would not want to be intoxicated badly enough to drink something that tasted and smelled like industrial solvent. The logic was also wrong. The community that had been drinking ether for several decades had developed, in that time, a relationship with the substance that proved rather more resilient than the government had anticipated. The naphtha adulterated ether arrived in the shops. The customers noted that it tasted considerably worse than usual. They held their noses more firmly, mixed the ether with sugar and spices to mask the additional offence, and continued. The only measurable effect of the naphtha adulteration, according to contemporary observers, was a temporary improvement in the regional trade in sugar, cloves, and other flavouring agents. The ether consumption continued at approximately its previous level. The naphtha approach had assumed that the mechanism was choice, that people were drinking ether because they preferred it to the alternatives, and that if the preference could be reversed by degrading the product, the choice would change. This assumption turned out to be incorrect. The mechanism was not preference. It was habit, infrastructure, and the absence of any substitute. Making ether worse did not create a substitute. It created worse ether. Close on. If the naphtha experiment had taught Parliament one lesson, it was that making a substance unpleasant was not the same as making it unavailable, and the distinction mattered considerably more than the government had initially assumed. In 1891, Mr. Balfour rose in the House of Commons to announce that ether had been scheduled as a poison under the Pharmacy Act. The scheduling was precise in its mechanism. From the date of the announcement, ether could only be sold by a qualified chemist or druggist, not by a grocer, not by a publican, not by a travelling salesman passing through a village on his regular rounds, not by a shopkeeper who had been handing small amounts to children as a matter of commercial courtesy for the better part of 20 years. The substance itself was not made illegal. A qualified pharmacist could still sell it to a patient who required it for legitimate purposes, with appropriate documentation recording the transaction. What ended was the distribution network. The ordinary retail infrastructure that had made ether as available as flour and candles in the affected counties for 50 years was, by the terms of the scheduling, no longer permitted to carry it. The grocer's shelf no longer held the small brown bottles. The publican's stock no longer included them. The salesman's bag no longer offered them at village stops. The ether-bee hostess who had previously sent a neighbour to the corner shop could no longer do so because the corner shop no longer had what she was asking for. The pharmacist was further away, required a formal interaction, and involved a documented transaction rather than the anonymous exchange of a penny across a counter. There was no debate in these market towns and village shops about whether to comply. The supply simply stopped arriving. The shelves that had carried ether were stocked with other things. The travelling salesman removed it from their standard lines. The mechanism was not coercion of the individual drinker. It was the removal of the thing the individual drinker had always done without thinking, which was walk into a shop and buy it. Close on, the era did not end because anyone in these counties decided to stop. It ended because the infrastructure that had made ether ordinary was removed from underneath it in a single administrative action. And ordinary is not something that survives the removal of its infrastructure. The distinction between the naphtha approach and the scheduling approach is worth being precise about, because it is the distinction that determined which one worked. Naphtha assumed that the operative mechanism was preference, that people drank ether because they chose to, that choice responded to incentives, and that making the experience sufficiently unpleasant would shift the choice toward other options. This is a reasonable assumption about how people behave in many situations. It is the assumption that underlies a great deal of regulatory thinking about substances, make the product more expensive or worse or less available, and consumption falls. In this case, the assumption failed at the first step. Making the product worse did not change the choice, it changed the product. Scheduling assumed something different. It assumed that the operative mechanism was not preference but infrastructure, that people drank ether not primarily because they preferred it to available alternatives, but because it was available, and that habits form around what is available without necessarily constituting a deliberate preference for it. On this view, removing the availability would dissolve the habit regardless of whether any preference had changed, because the habit had never been a preference in the strict sense. It had been a practice sustained by convenience. A penny-a-draught habit conducted at the grocer's counter on the way home from market could not survive a system that required a pharmacist, a documented transaction, a formal request, a journey of several miles, and an explanation of purpose. The pharmacist requirement did not merely make ether harder to obtain, it changed the social meaning of obtaining it entirely. A man who walked into a pharmacist's and asked for ether for drinking purposes was now doing something that marked him as a person who drank ether, a thing that required accounting for. A man who picked up a bottle at the grocer's had been doing something that required no accounting at all. The social infrastructure of the ether habit, the ether-bee, the fair day, the travelling salesman, the shopkeeper's courtesy, had been built on the invisibility of acquisition. When acquisition became visible and formal and documented, the social infrastructure lost what it had been built on. Close on, the habit did not vanish immediately. Some areas held on, but it had lost the quality that had always been its true foundation, and that quality, once removed, proved impossible to reconstruct through any of the routes the remaining users tried. The years after 1891 moved slowly towards silence. The smell did not disappear overnight from the market towns of counties Londonderry and Tyrone. Habits that have been established across a generation do not dissolve in a season, and the scheduling had removed the supply infrastructure without removing the habit itself, which meant that for some years the two existed in a state of tension. The habit present, the infrastructure gone, the people who had formed the habit gradually discovering that maintaining it now required effort that the habit had never previously required. Some people made that effort. There were those who travelled to pharmacists, who found other means, who maintained the practice through routes that were inconvenient enough to gradually discourage everyone except those who were most committed. There were areas where ether drinking persisted into the early years of the 20th century, held in place by the memory of how things had been and the difficulty of adjusting to their absence. But the habit could not reproduce itself into the next generation. Children who had grown up watching their mothers at the ether bee, who had arrived at school with a smell on their breath, who had accepted the shopkeeper's courtesy across the counter, those children grew into adults who could no longer acquire it easily, and they did not, and their children never encountered it at all. By 1923, when ether drinking was made a criminal offence in Northern Ireland, the legislation was primarily historical. The practice it prohibited had already mostly ended, not with a particular event or a moment of collective decision, but gradually, the way anything ends when the infrastructure that sustained it is quietly removed and not replaced. Close on, the towns still stood. The fair days continued. The chemist still opened on Thursday mornings. Only the smell was gone, and with it the habit, and with the habit the particular quality of those mornings that the smell had been part of for 50 years. The mechanism that had produced the Irish ether epidemic was not unique to Ireland, or to the Victorian era, or to ether. In the years between the two world wars, in the region of Upper Silesia in what was then part of Poland, restrictions on the availability of alcohol created conditions that were recognisably similar to those Father Matthew had created in Ireland 80 years earlier. The gap between what was forbidden and what was available needed to be filled. Ether filled it. Surveys conducted in certain Upper Silesian villages in the 1930s found that a significant proportion of schoolchildren were regularly drinking ether. The same substance, the same method, the same pattern of availability through ordinary retail channels, the same integration into social life. Different country, different decade, different people who had no knowledge of Draperstown or the Pledge, or Dr. Kelly or the Ether Bee. The same result. The pattern holds because the mechanism is not cultural. It is not specific to Irish Catholicism or Victorian respectability or any particular set of social arrangements. It is the mechanism that operates whenever a community has a genuine need that a forbidden substance used to meet, and an available substance that can meet it instead. The available substance becomes what the forbidden substance was. The habit forms around what is there. When what is there changes, the habit changes with it. Father Matthew had not created the Irish desire for relief from the conditions of life in rural Ulster. He had created the conditions under which that desire found its particular chemical expression. Close on, the shape in Silesia was different. The school children were different. The decade was different. The problem, the gap, the need, the available substance that stepped into it, was the same one that had produced 17,000 gallons a year in 5 Irish counties, and it would produce the same pattern wherever those conditions recurred, which was wherever prohibition met genuine need and left a chemical gap between them. While all of this was reaching its conclusion in Ireland, the report, the scheduling, the slow decline, the smell fading from the hedges, the same substance was doing something entirely different in Paris. Not 17,000 gallons, not a penny a draught, not the grocer's shelf or the travelling salesman or the ether bee or the Tuesday afternoon gathering in someone's kitchen. In the drawing rooms and cafes and private apartments of fin de siècle Paris, ether circulated in small glass vials alongside morphine, cocaine, hashish and absinthe. In the company of writers and artists who were interested not in escape from consciousness, but in an alternate version of it. They approached the substance with the attention of people who considered what happened to their minds to be professionally significant, and they described what they found with some care. The Irish drinkers had wanted relief from the conditions of life in rural Ulster, a temporary respite from poverty, from the constraints of the pledge, from the Tuesday afternoon that had no other available improvement. The Parisian users wanted something closer to the opposite. They were not trying to reduce the quality of consciousness. They were trying to access a different register of it, clearer in some directions, more associative in others, operating at a slight remove from the body that housed it. The same substance that produced flammable emissions in County Derry and allowed the ether bee to conclude without incident was, in Paris, being considered as a tool for thinking in ways that ordinary sobriety did not facilitate. The delivery mechanism in Paris was, appropriately, more elaborate. An ether-soaked strawberry floating in a glass of champagne was one favoured method, the fruit slowing the evaporation of the volatile liquid and allowing it to be consumed in a more controlled fashion. Small glass vials were carried in jacket pockets and brought out at appropriate moments. The substance was added to cocktails in careful quantities. The social occasion surrounding it was calibrated to what it was for. Close on, the people drinking ether-infused champagne in Paris were not thinking about Thursday mornings in Draperstown. They were thinking about what happened to the quality of thought when the mind was given a small chemical opportunity to observe itself from a slight distance. This, it turned out, was a question that certain writers found extremely productive. The writers of fin de siècle Paris were not, as a rule, looking for relief. They had, most of them, more than enough to feel. What they were looking for was a way to observe what they felt from a slightly different angle, a small chemical adjustment to the position of the mind relative to its own operations. This was a specific ambition, and it required a specific kind of substance. As it turned out, ether fit the description reasonably well. It also fit the price. Ether was available from ordinary pharmacies, which gave it a respectability that the more disreputable substances in the Parisian pharmacopoeia did not entirely possess. It was medical. It was the substance that had conquered surgical pain. A writer who used ether was, in some sense, aligning himself with the same tradition that had made Morton's demonstration at Massachusetts General Hospital the most celebrated medical event of the century. This was, in the circles where ether circulated in Paris, a not entirely insignificant distinction. Paris in the 1880s was running on a pharmacopoeia that would have unsettled a modern pharmacy inspector. Morphine for the nerves, cocaine for the energy, or what passed for energy in a literary milieu that considered exhaustion a mark of seriousness. Hashish for the visions that the Romantics had pioneered and the symbolists were still pursuing. Absinthe for the general atmosphere of creative dissolution that the era had decided was professionally appropriate and that the bright green colour made conveniently visible. And alongside all of these, carried in small glass vials in jacket pockets, added to drinks in careful quantities, obtained from the same pharmacies that supplied it for legitimate medical complaints, ether. It was not a mass phenomenon in Paris the way it was in Ireland. In Ireland, the ether culture was wide and deep, 100,000 people across 5 counties, a substance as available as bread, woven into every layer of ordinary life from the ether bee to the fair day to the school morning breath. The Parisian ether culture was narrow and deliberate, a particular kind of person, in particular kinds of rooms, pursuing a particular quality of experience that ordinary consciousness did not reliably provide. Writers, painters, critics, the professionally melancholic. The people who had decided that how they spent their evenings was a matter of artistic principle. The distinction was not one of moral sophistication. The Irish drinkers had reasons for their habit at least as cogent as anything the Parisian writers could articulate. What differed was the purpose, and with the purpose, the dose, and with the dose, the experience. Close on, in the world these writers inhabited, what you consumed was as much a statement about what you were pursuing as it was about what you wanted to feel. Ether was a pursuit. The strawberry and the champagne was the equipment for a particular kind of expedition into the available territory of consciousness, and the expedition was considered worth taking. The method that had become fashionable in certain Parisian circles was more elaborate than the Irish draught, and considerably more elaborate than the London apparatus, and it was more elaborate in a way that said something about who was using it and what they thought they were doing. An ether-soaked strawberry was placed in a glass of champagne and allowed to float there. The fruit served a practical function. Ether is so volatile that in open air it evaporates almost immediately, but inside a strawberry, absorbed into its fibres, held by the fruit's density and moisture, it released gradually into the champagne surrounding it, in a form that could be consumed before it disappeared into the air. The champagne itself contributed something. The carbonation carried the ether vapours upward through the liquid in small consistent quantities, producing an effect that was more controlled and more gradual than either the Irish draught or the London inhalation. The result was a drink that tasted of champagne and strawberry, with a chemical undertone that those familiar with it recognised immediately, and those unfamiliar with it could not quite identify. It was served at gatherings. It appeared on tables alongside the other drinks of the evening, unremarkable to the people who knew what it was and mildly puzzling to the people who did not. It was, by the standards of Parisian social life in the 1880s, an entirely acceptable way to open an evening, in the same way that the ether frolic had been an acceptable way to open an evening in a London drawing room 40 years earlier. The same chemical process that, in County Derry, involved a small drop on the tongue while pinching the nose firmly shut and chasing the whole thing with a glass of water, was here being conducted with champagne, a piece of fruit, and the ambient lighting of a well-appointed apartment. Close on, the chemistry was identical. The context was not, and the context was doing a very large amount of work in determining what the experience meant to the people having it. The subjective experience at Parisian doses was different from the Irish version, not only because the doses were different, but because the attention brought to it was different. The Irish drinker wanted the effect over quickly, the rapid onset, the fast exit, the return to functional sobriety in time for the afternoon's work. The Parisian writer wanted to stay inside the experience long enough to observe it, which required a smaller dose, a slower delivery, and the kind of attention that produces useful notes afterward. What they found, when they paid this kind of attention, was a sequence that differed from the Irish experience in quality rather than kind. The first thing that arrived, in small doses carefully administered, was not the warmth and euphoria of the ether frolic. It was something described, consistently and across multiple accounts, as a peculiar clarity, thoughts arriving in an unusual order, connections forming between things that ordinarily stayed separate, the mind appearing to work faster than usual, or at least differently, making associations that it would not ordinarily make, seeing relations between things that ordinary consciousness kept in separate categories. This was not hallucination. It was the opposite of hallucination, an unusually ordered attention, a temporarily accelerated intelligence. Then, as the dose deepened, the dissociation arrived, the sense of the mind operating at a slight remove from the body, watching its own processes from a short distance, aware of itself thinking in a way that ordinary consciousness did not permit. Some described this as a feeling of the soul separating from the body. Others described it as simply a more vivid version of self-awareness. All of them described it as productive. Close on, the Irish were getting through Thursday. These people were taking notes on Thursday, and the notes were, by their own assessment, unusually interesting. Guy de Maupassant was not, when he began using ether, looking for a literary experience. He was looking for relief from a catalogue of physical complaints that had occupied most of his adult life. Migraines, neuralgia, failing eyesight, a succession of symptoms that his physicians attributed to various causes and that later analysis has connected with reasonable confidence to syphilis contracted in his youth. He used ether because it eased these conditions. He continued using it for reasons that became, over time, increasingly difficult to categorize as purely medicinal. The experiences he documented were specific. Small red men sitting in armchairs that were not there, observed with the mild interest of a man who finds an unexpected visitor in his house. and has decided after a moment's assessment that the situation is manageable. His soul departing his body and hovering nearby in a state of detached observation, watching himself exist from a short distance. Walking into his own house and encountering himself already sitting on the sofa, a duplicate Maupassant, composed and apparently comfortable, who had arrived before the original. These were not, he was careful to note, frightening experiences. They were interesting ones. The small red men were simply there. The duplicate on the sofa was simply present. The soul hovering nearby was simply watching. The tone of his accounts is curiously equable, the tone of a man reporting an observation rather than surviving a crisis. He wrote about these experiences in letters to friends, in his fiction, in the direct and somewhat clinical language of a writer who considers his own consciousness a legitimate subject of inquiry. He was, by almost any measure, doing exactly what the Parisian intellectual culture of his era expected him to do with an unusual experience, paying attention to it and writing it down. He eventually used ether in quantities that his already compromised health could not sustain, which was perhaps an inevitable outcome for a man who treated his nervous system as a research material. But the trajectory from medical use to continuation for other reasons is very clearly documented in his case, and the other reasons were not obscure. Close on, these were not the experiences of someone who had taken too much accidentally. They were the experiences of someone who knew what he was pursuing, found it where he expected to find it, and went back. In 1882, Maupassant published a short story called Dreams. The premise is simple. A group of jaded, neurasthenic Parisian diners gather after a meal and discuss the impossibility of genuine experience. The ennui that flattens everything, the insomnia that ruins the nights, the absence of any sensation that feels genuinely new. One of them tries opium. He finds it heavy and dreamless. Another has tried hashish and found it merely confirmed what he already suspected about the unreliability of the imagination. They have, as a group, covered the available options and found them insufficient. One man among them, a doctor, listens to this familiar complaint with an air of mild amusement. He has something to offer that is not opium, not hashish, not any of the usual solutions his companions have already exhausted and found wanting. He offers them ether. His description of what ether provides is the most precise rendering in 19th century fiction of what the substance actually does to a certain kind of mind at a certain kind of dose. He describes reasoning, he says, with the utmost clearness and depth, with extraordinary energy and intellectual pleasure, with a singular intoxication arising from this separation of his mental faculties. The mind operating as if freed from the body's interference, the body continuing its biological business while the mind runs a separate, faster, more associative program. He calls this state, without apparent irony, the tree of knowledge. The story's other characters listen and are persuaded. They try it. What follows is a series of accounts of what each person experienced, each inflected by personality and expectation, each somewhat different in its particulars, but sharing the quality of having provided access to a mode of consciousness that ordinary Tuesday evenings in Paris did not offer. The story ends without a moral and without resolution, which is the accurate ending. The diners will meet again. They will do this again. The substance will be there. Maupassant was writing from experience, and the experience was continuing. Close on, the Irish farmer arrested for disorderly conduct, sober in the police van within the hour, had inhaled the same molecule as the doctor in the story. The distance between their experiences was the distance between a penny and a philosophy, which is not, on reflection, as large a distance as it sounds. Ether's place in the broader literary culture of the fin de siècle was not incidental. The era was conducting, through various means and substances, a systematic investigation of the available versions of consciousness. What ordinary sobriety provided, what each alteration to it opened up, what states of mind existed that daily life did not make accessible. Opium, hashish, cocaine, absinthe and ether were all participants in this investigation, each one valued for what it specifically did, rather than for intoxication as a general category. Ether was valued for the dissociation, the same property that made it useful in surgery, the capacity to place the patient's awareness at a distance from what was happening to their body, translated at smaller doses into a version of that distance applied to thought itself, the mind slightly beside itself, the narrator slightly behind the narrator, the uncanny doubling that appears throughout the literature of this period, the doppelganger, the double, the self encountered in a mirror or across a room, has various sources, but ether is among them, and not a minor one. Maupassant saw himself on his sofa. He described the experience calmly and with the precision of a man recording an observation rather than confessing a symptom. Other writers of the period described similar states in their fiction without identifying the source, which is the more common way that intoxicants make their way into literature, not as subjects but as methods. The writing produced under ether's influence was not writing about ether. It was writing that had been loosened from its ordinary constraints by ether, and that showed the traces of that loosening in its texture. Close on, the same substance that Father Matthew's movement had accidentally endorsed as an alternative to whiskey was, in Paris, producing certain qualities of literary attention that critics would later describe as distinctively modern. Nobody had planned this either. The Irish farmer, the medical student at St. Bartholomew's, the Victorian hostess, the Parisian writer with a glass of champagne and a soaked strawberry. The irony is easier to state than to fully absorb. All of them were using diethyl ether, the same compound that Valerius Cordus synthesized in the 1540s by mixing sulfuric acid with ethanol and called sweet oil of vitriol. The same compound that Paracelsus tried on chickens and found put them to sleep without apparent harm, after which he concluded that it quieted all suffering and then did not pursue the matter further, which was the first in a series of opportunities that the substance had to transform medicine and did not take, because nobody was paying quite the right kind of attention yet. The same compound that Crawford Long observed at an ether frolic in Georgia and used to remove a tumour from James Venable's neck without his patient feeling anything, for which he charged $1. The same compound that Morton administered to Edward Abbott while John Collins Warren waited, and that Warren then described with the sentence that every newspaper in the English-speaking world reprinted within the month. The same compound that the chemists of County Londonderry ordered by the case every Thursday, that the travelling salesmen carried in their standard bags, that the mothers put on the table at Ether B's, and the shopkeepers offered to children across the counter as a gesture of ordinary commercial hospitality. The substance had travelled, without any alteration to its chemistry, through every social class available to the Victorian era, across 3 countries that knew nothing of each other's version of the habit, and into every use that its properties permitted and its era found for it. It had done all of this while remaining exactly what it had always been, a colourless, volatile liquid with a sweetish chemical smell and a boiling point low enough that it evaporated at the first opportunity, leaving no trace on the breath and no mark on anything it passed through. What changed was not the liquid. Close on, what changed was what each society needed from it, what each society was prepared to permit, and what happened when the permission was revoked, which, in most cases, was that the habit stopped, the infrastructure dismantled itself, and the substance returned to being what it had been before any of this, a compound in a bottle on a shelf, waiting for someone to notice what it was capable of. What the era actually was is easier to see from the end of it than from inside it. Victorian society had spent decades constructing an apparatus of visible virtue, sobriety as a public performance, self-control as a measure of character, respectability as something demonstrated in visible signs, how you smelled, how you stood, the composure of your face, the steadiness with which you moved through the world. This apparatus was real. It had consequences. It shaped careers and marriages and social standing and political outcomes. To be seen as intemperate was to be located outside the respectable order, which was a specific and material position to occupy in a society where the respectable order controlled most of what mattered. and then a medical substance arrived that the apparatus could not detect. The story of Victorian ether is, at its simplest, the story of that gap. The gap between what the apparatus was designed to see and what it could actually see. Between what Victorian morality had built and what Victorian morality had accidentally left unaddressed. Between the performance of respectability and the 20 minutes, undetectable, in which the performance was temporarily suspended. The gap was not large. It was precisely the width of one chemical property, the absence of a residual smell. But in a society organised around visible evidence, the absence of evidence was everything. What Victorian society actually wanted from ether was not intoxication as such. It was the exit that came after. Every other available intoxicant left evidence: a smell, a flush, an unsteadiness, a sentiment that arrived uninvited and required explanation the following morning. Ether left nothing. The person who had taken an ether hour was, 20 minutes later, exactly as they had been before, with nothing to account for and nothing to apologise for and nothing that any available social test could identify as having occurred. This was not a minor property. In a society organised around the detection of visible excess, an intoxicant that produced no visible evidence was not merely convenient. It was structurally significant. It fit inside the apparatus of respectability the way a key fits inside a lock, not by breaking the mechanism but by working within it, exploiting the specific gap between what the mechanism was designed to detect and what it could actually see. The drawing rooms wanted this. The medical students wanted this. The Victorian hostess who offered the apparatus between dinner and cards wanted this. What they wanted was not escape from respectability. They valued respectability. They had organised their lives around it. They had no desire to abandon it. What they wanted was a temporary and invisible suspension of it. 20 minutes of not being entirely themselves, followed by the complete restoration of themselves, with no evidence that anything had occurred. Across the Irish Sea, the pledge takers wanted something recognisably similar at a different price point. The form was different, a penny draft from the grocer's shelf rather than an apparatus in a drawing room. The invisibility was different. The Irish town smelled of ether for anyone approaching from outside, even as the individual drinker remained personally unmarked. But the structure of the need was the same. A society that had made a specific form of escape morally unavailable, finding a specific form of escape that the available moral framework could not quite reach. Close on, ether did not create that need. It answered it in the most efficient form that 19th century chemistry happened to make available. The moral shield that made all of this possible was not an accident, but it was not a plan either. Nobody in Morton's operating theatre in 1846 was thinking about drawing room parties or Irish temperance pledges. Nobody at the celebrations following the Ether Dome demonstration was thinking about what would happen when the most celebrated medical substance of the century became available over the counter from ordinary chemists and grocers. The newspapers that declared pain conquered were celebrating a genuine triumph. They were not constructing a loophole. The loophole constructed itself from the raw materials of genuine celebration. The moral shield was built from the same wood as the triumph. Ether was the substance that had conquered surgical pain. It had been administered to the Queen. The medical profession had published it, taught it, built an entire new discipline around it. Parliament had said nothing restricting it, because Parliament was busy celebrating it. The Church of England had raised an objection to chloroform, and then fallen silent when Victoria's position made the argument untenable. Every institution that might have supplied the language for disapproval had already used its vocabulary on approval. The temperance movement presents the purest version of this problem. It had spent decades building a fully articulated moral grammar for condemning alcohol. The weakness it represented, the poverty it caused, the families it destroyed, the public disorder it produced. This grammar was detailed, emotionally resonant, institutionally supported and widely understood. It described alcohol with considerable precision. It did not describe ether, because ether was not alcohol, and the grammar had been built to fit alcohol's specific properties, and the properties did not transfer. A temperance advocate confronted with an ether party faced a version of the problem that the entire apparatus of Victorian moral argument had not prepared them for, a substance that produced intoxication without any of the signs the moral argument had been built to identify. No public disorder, the effects were brief and quiet. No smell, the substance evaporated. No hangover, the body processed it cleanly. No poverty. The drawing room version was a middle-class entertainment. The grammar that condemned alcohol had nothing to grip. Close on, the conquest of surgical pain had, as a side effect that nobody noticed for some years, conquered the available language for objecting to what came next, and left a silence in that space large enough to hold half a century of ether parties. 1891 ended the era not with a reckoning but with an administrative adjustment. Parliament's scheduling of ether as a poison did not represent a moral decision about escape and respectability and the right of a society to intoxicate itself. It represented a practical response to a specific documented problem. 17,000 gallons a year in 5 Irish counties, 100,000 users, children arriving at school smelling of a surgical anesthetic, the constabulary unable to charge the people they arrested because those people were sober by the time they arrived at the station. These were problems that invited a practical solution, and scheduling was a practical solution. The moral question, whether Victorian society had been right to use ether as it had, whether the drawing room hour and the ether bee and the Parisian strawberry represented something that needed moral addressing, was not the question Parliament was answering. Parliament was answering the 17,000 gallons. What the scheduling ended, along with the specific documented problem, was the broader apparatus that the documented problem had been part of. The grocer's shelf stopped carrying ether, not because anyone had decided that the Victorian drawing room ether hour was morally objectionable, but because ether was now restricted to pharmacists, and the restriction applied everywhere. The drawing rooms moved on for the same reason the Irish fair days moved on. The supply infrastructure that had made ether ordinary had been removed, and without the infrastructure, ordinary could not be maintained. The desire that ether had answered did not go away. Victorian society, moving into the Edwardian era and then into the 20th century, found other means and other substances, which is a different story and a longer one. What ended in 1891 was not the need. What ended was the specific, legal, medically endorsed, consequence-free, undetectable form in which the need had been answered. Close on, Victorian society had found a way to stop being Victorian for 20 minutes at a time. Parliament had found a way to close that exit. What remained on the other side of the closing was just the ordinary Thursday, without the thing that had been making it manageable, which is a description of every Thursday that had preceded the 1840s, and which is where things returned. The physical reality of the end was gradual. The small brown bottles disappeared from the grocer's shelves and the publican's stock, and the travelling salesman's bag over the course of weeks and months following the scheduling. There was no moment of collective surrender, no ceremony, no final ether bee with an awareness that it was final. The supply simply stopped arriving at the places it had always arrived, because the regulatory change had severed the supply chain at the points where it had always been most accessible, and the accessible points were the ones the habit had been built around. The ether bee became something that happened, and then something that happened less often, and then something that some women remembered attending and others had not experienced. The apparatus in London drawing rooms was put away, into the drawer where fashionable things go when they are no longer fashionable, alongside other objects that had briefly seemed important, and then quietly stopped being so. The apparatus had always been moderately absurd, which was part of its appeal, and it became, in the absence of the substance it was designed to deliver, simply absurd without the moderation. The smell faded from the market towns at the pace of a habit losing its supply. Not overnight. Over months and seasons, the sweet chemical air that had preceded those towns from a distance became less present, less reliable, less the thing that told you where you were before you arrived. The hedges stopped carrying it, the houses stopped carrying it, the fair days happened, and the transactions were conducted, and the prices were argued, and the livestock was assessed, and the business was done, and the air smelled of what air in those towns had always smelled of before the 1840s, which was to say it smelled of nothing in particular. Things that end gradually leave a gradual absence. The gradual absence is harder to locate than a sudden one. It has no precise moment, no identifiable last instance, only the slow accumulation of ordinary days without the thing that had distinguished the previous ordinary days. Close on, nobody recorded the last fair day in Draper's Town that smelled of ether, because nobody knew it was the last one while it was happening. It simply became the previous one, and then the one before that, until the whole sequence had receded into the category of something that used to happen here, which is the most complete form of ending available to things that were never quite scandals while they were occurring. What ether left behind on the medical side of the ledger was considerable. The Ether Dome at Massachusetts General Hospital is a National Historic Landmark. Visitors still walk through it. The operating theatre, where Warren said this is no humbug, looks more or less as it did in 1846. The tiered seating, the domed ceiling, the table in the centre where Edward Abbott was not screaming. Display cases at either end of the room hold surgical instruments from Morton's day, their blades dull with age. At the front of the room, for reasons that remain somewhat opaque, an Egyptian mummy keeps watch over the space. Crawford Long is remembered in Georgia. Long County was named for him. A hospital in Atlanta bore his name until it became part of Emory University. His claim to have been the first to use ether as a surgical anesthetic, the claim he did not publish until Morton had already taken the credit, is now generally acknowledged in the way that history eventually acknowledges the people it initially overlooked. The surgical revolution that ether began did not end with ether. Chloroform replaced it, and was then itself replaced by halothane, and halothane by a succession of modern anesthetic agents, each one safer and more predictable and less flammable than the last. The field of anesthesiology, which did not exist before Morton's demonstration, is now among the most technically demanding specialties in medicine. Every surgery conducted painlessly, every patient who has ever gone under and come back without the experience of the interval, is a consequence of the chain that began in Georgia in 1842 and was made public in Boston in 1846. Close on, the medicine survived everything. The Ether Dome is a landmark. The party, which contributed to starting the medicine, left almost nothing visible except a few journal articles, and a parliamentary debate, and Maupassant's short story, and the memory, in certain parts of County Londonderry, of what Thursday mornings used to smell like. The entire Victorian ether era, every version of it from St Bartholomew's to Draper's Town to the champagne glass in Paris, depended on one chemical fact. Diethyl ether evaporates almost instantly in open air. Its boiling point is 34 degrees Celsius. At room temperature it vaporizes readily. In the human body it processes and departs within the hour. It leaves no smell of alcohol on the breath because it is not alcohol. It leaves no smell of anything in particular on the breath because by the time the breath is being evaluated the substance is already gone. This single property, the absence of a residual smell, was the foundation on which everything else rested. The drawing room parties depended on it. The medical students who called the experience glorious and went back for it the following week depended on it. The Victorian hostess who offered the apparatus between dinner and cards, and whose guests accepted it and went home unremarkable, depended on it. The businessman who returned home at 8 with nothing to explain depended on it. The moral shield depended on it, because a substance that left no smell on the breath could not be condemned with the vocabulary that had been built to condemn the smell of alcohol, which was specific and recognisable and everywhere. Even the Irish, whose market towns announced themselves by their smell before you could see them, were drinking something that left the individual drinker personally unmarked. The communal atmosphere was ether. The person walking through it was 20 minutes later indistinguishable from a person who had not. The smell belonged to the place, not the person. It was the weather, not the record. It was community evidence that no individual could be held accountable for, which is a form of invisibility that the London version had also been pursuing by a different route. A society that had made a virtue of showing nothing had found the one substance that showed nothing. The apparatus of respectability tested for visible evidence. Ether produced none. The test passed. The apparatus declared the person acceptable. The person had, 20 minutes earlier, been somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the apparatus could not reach, and the moral grammar could not name, and the law could not charge, and the social sanction could not apply. This was the arrangement. It held for nearly 50 years because it served both parties simultaneously. The society that needed to believe in the performance of visible virtue, and the individuals within it who needed, occasionally and reliably, to stop performing it. The substance made both things possible at once. It asked nothing in return except that it be permitted to continue, and for nearly half a century it was. And when it was gone, it left exactly what it had always left. No smell, no evidence. The empty bottle, the cleared room, the ordinary silence of a Thursday morning in a town that no longer had a reason to smell of anything in particular.